In terms of hedges, I have always had a strong affinity for hedges from my childhood. But then I also got involved when I was still in college. I took a year out and I started working on the Northern Ireland Countryside Survey. And that meant doing botanical surveys all over Northern Ireland. And because I was the kind of junior assistant, it meant that I got put on the hedgerow stuff quite a lot. But that was amazing, rambling around Northern Ireland. And from that, went on to do my own hedgerow surveys. When I came back down from the north, I got involved with the Irish Wildlife Trust and set up a hedgerow survey there. So the first, I'd say, ecological professional job that I got project was a hedgerow survey in County Kildare. So that was right up to the borders of West Wicklow. And the objective there was looking at the comparison between townland boundary hedges and non-townland boundary hedges. But I'll go into that a little bit more in the history, which is coming up next. But just as a general introduction, hedgerows are an amazing resource that are quite particular to Ireland. We can see here that it's very characteristic of our landscapes. If we could picture our landscapes without hedges, there would be a lot less diversity and colour, and they define a lot of our agricultural landscapes in Ireland, and they cover about 1.5% of our land area in Ireland. Now that sounds very low, but when we think of our native woodlands, they cover about, it was 0.5% kind of 15 years ago. It's up to something like 0.8%, I think, of our landscape now is covered in native woodlands. So there's twice as much land area covered in hedges as there are in native woodlands. So that will tell you just how significant our hedgerows are on a landscape perspective, as well as for wildlife. Hedgerows also have important function in the landscape in terms of shelter for animals, the function on the farm, which I'll talk about more later, about water, carbon, soil, all of these different aspects of our natural environment. Hedgerows are quite an important feature of in Ireland, and we have about 300,000 kilometres of hedges in Ireland, so that's quite a lot. The ones in this photo aren't in great condition, but you get a sense on the right hand side of some of the wildlife. So we've got ivy there somewhere in between the flowering and the berries. We've got hawthorn flowers beneath that. Here we've got the sloe berries. These are spindleberries, these bright red berries. We've got a little mouse here clambering through, eating some blackberries. We've got a hedgehog. Hedgehogs, incidentally, are not native to Ireland, but they were probably brought in by monks, they reckon, in the early medieval times, specifically because they eat so many slugs. So this is a handy thing if you're in a monastery and you're starting up a garden and you've got a lot of slugs. So they brought in hedgehogs. Anyway, so the next thing, where do our hedges come from? Hedges are not a natural feature. Most of us assume that they kind of are, and they've always been there, but they're not. When people first started clearing away our forests, our woodlands, way back in the Neolithic and, well, yeah, in the Neolithic and then the Bronze Age, they would have cleared woodlands back, and there would have been naturally the kind of the thorny species, like the hawthorn would have done well, those woodland edge species. So you would naturally have a hedgerow type flora at the edges of the woodlands. But most of our hedges were planted up in the 1700s, the 1800s, the Enclosures Acts. But before that, when we had townlands, in the medieval times, land was divided up into units called townlands, and townland boundaries tended to be marked with a big hedgerow. So they're slightly different around the country, but a townland boundary hedge tends to have a really big bank and a really big ditch and a line of hedgerow shrubs and mature trees. And if you go out now for a walk over the next few days, have a look at some of the hedges around your area, see, can you get an inkling of some of the difference between the townland boundary hedges, which are really big structures, and then the later Enclosures Acts hedges. So the Enclosures Acts would have been in the 1700s and the 1800s, and that's when open ground, the Enclosures Acts dictated that they should be sectioned off into hedge-bound fields, and that was to do with the agricultural improvements and keeping certain breeds of sheep from each other, keeping cows away from the sheep, keeping the sheep away from the tillage fields. It was very practical. Before we had barbed wire fences, hedges made a lot of sense. When I did the Kildare hedgerow survey, what I was looking at was the species diversity between the shrubs and the trees growing in the hedges. And there were some really interesting findings. Hazel, for example, in Kildare anyway, grows almost exclusively in townland boundary hedges. It doesn't really appear in the later Enclosures Act hedges. Hornbeam, holly, spindle, Gelder rose, these are all species that you tend to find in the townland boundary hedges. So they're much more species rich. So when you go out and have a look and see, can you tell the differences in the structure, then you can go and you can look at the earliest maps. They are online, Ordnance Survey Ireland, and you can see the townland boundary hedges, they're marked differently, and see, can you match those up with the hedges in your area? And that'll be quite an interesting experiment. Yeah, so most of our hedges, they're definitely not natural. The majority are probably 150, 200 years old, but some, the townland boundary hedges, are really old. Now, the hedges that I remember scrambling around in West Wicklow, there was a lot of beech in the hedges, and I think that was to do with the estates. Like Humphreys House was not far from where I grew up, and they would have planted a lot of beech. And this is really more like a tree line than a hedge, if you can see that. But they do, the one on the left here has quite a small bank, the one on the right has a much bigger bank. Beech is not a native tree in Ireland, and the amount of diversity in terms of wildlife that you would find in beech is much reduced. There are much fewer invertebrates associated with beech. It also has a compound inside the leaf that the leaf litter prevents other species from growing up. So you'll see in a beech woodland or under a beech hedge, there's an absence of ground flora, what we call ground flora. So all those little herbs and smaller plants and shrubs, they don't like, there's a repellent in the beech leaves that keeps them apart, and it's the way of beech dominating in the landscape, really. Another thing that is distinctive about West Wicklow and the hilly ground and the acid soils, there'd be a lot of gorse in the hedges in West Wicklow. And holly is another species that can cope quite well with thin soils and acidic ground. So beech, holly and gorse would be things that I would associate more with the West Wicklow and the upland hedges, which are not so typical around the rest of the country. I have studied hedges in a lot of detail in Laois and Offaly and Westmeath and Roscommon, little bits in Kerry, Leitrim, Cavan, Wicklow. So I have spent many summer days scrambling through hedges, recording exactly what species and observing the structure of the hedge banks as well, how they're built. And it's really, if you look closely, some are an earthen bank that are lined with stones. In Westmeath, they have these very thick stone banks, and the hedgerow shrubs are planted into those effectively stone walls or stone banks. In other places, you've got very tall, a lot of West Wicklow, you'd have very tall banks and a line of gorse planted in along the top of them. So there's a huge variety in hedges across the country. Hedges on the farm, they're, as I say, a very functional feature of our farmland. You can see this bottom picture here with the cows. That would be an intensive dairy farm with a lot of ryegrass, where the hedges have been removed because it's more convenient to have electric fences, because they're easier to move and they seem to take up less space. But I always feel very sorry for the cattle in a field on a rainy day, even a summer storm, when they have nowhere to go. Whereas when you have a good big hedge, you can see whether it's sheep or cows, they tend to huddle in alongside the hedge to stay dry. And again, there's function in that. It's an animal welfare issue, for one. But if you're standing out in the field in the wind and getting wet all day, you're going to lose energy a lot more. You're going to have to eat a lot more. You're probably going to be less healthy. You're more likely to catch a cold or something. There's a health issue for the animals who have a good thick hedge to shelter under. As well as the fact that hedges bring a huge amount of diversity to the farm, not just in sheltering farm animals. Hedges take management, and I will go into that later, to stay as a hedge, because a hawthorn tree doesn't necessarily want to be a hedge, it wants to be a tree. So most hedges, if left to their own devices, will grow into a line of trees. So to maintain that as a hedge, there's a requirement for management. But more on that in a moment. This is, can you see the little photos here on the side? Are they in the way of the picture there? There's a wonderful artist called Yanni Peters who lives up in Glencree, which is not quite West Wicklow, but she has done a series of hedgerow exhibitions, and she's got calendars with a lot of botanical art, and she's done a series on hedgerows. So here I've got winter, spring, summer and autumn throughout this presentation. We can see here the hedgerow in winter. The thing that's most distinctive about a hedgerow in winter is the ivy. And ivy is something that is evergreen. It retains its foliage throughout the winter months. And that's really important for a lot of insects who are pupate over the winter, caterpillars, butterflies, moths. It's also important for bats who are hibernating through the winter. In the spring and the summer and the autumn, it's important for bat roosts as well. But hedgerows, sometimes you see, I was out in Phoenix Park there at the weekend, and there was a line of hawthorn trees, and two of them were covered in ivy throughout the canopy. And that can be a problem, in that if the tree is quite old and has some decay and is vulnerable to being blown over anyway, the ivy can act a bit like a sail and help carry it over. But there isn't nearly so much of a problem with ivy as is perceived. A lot of people think that ivy is a pest, that it's parasites on trees. It doesn't. It has a special little glue, the ivy, you know, those little tendrils on the ivy, that it makes its own organic glue that sticks itself to the bark of the tree that it's climbing up, and it uses the tree like a scaffolding. So it doesn't actually take any of the nutrients from the trees that it's growing on. Yeah, and here we can see again, there's a whole lot of habitat in that hedge bank throughout the winter months that you're just not going to get in an open field. There's some details for Yanni if people are interested to look up her work or get her calendars. Hedgerow birds. This figure that goes around, about 2/3 of Ireland's songbirds nest in hedgerows. Blackbirds, robins, wrens, thrushes, they all like the density of the growth, especially if it's good, thick, thorny growth. So around about the bottom 1.5 to 2 meters of a hedge, so let's say as tall as an average human, downwards, that's the thick, thorny part of the hedge, and that's what's really important to give that shelter and protection for nesting birds, so that the predatory animals cannot get in at them and steal their eggs or steal their chicks. So hedgerows are really important for our birds. Apart from the nesting and the sheltering, we have a little caterpillar here. Caterpillar eats the leaves. Little blue tits time their first brood from their nest to eat all of the caterpillars, to feed the caterpillars to their young chicks. And if there's a mismatch in that, what we're seeing now with earlier bud burst, the leaves are coming out in the trees earlier than what they would have before. So the wildlife that's adapted to the timing of spring can be out of kilter. And the leaves, as they get tougher, build up more things like tannin, which are indigestible to young birds. So if you're feeding a young chick a caterpillar that's laden with tannin, the chick won't necessarily be able to digest it properly. So there's problems there in the timing of bud burst. But it just gives an example of, well, it's not just for the shelter of the hedges. There's everything, all the invertebrates that our songbirds eat can be found in hedges. Beetles, snails, spiders, caterpillars, mice. And there's a lovely barn owl there. Barn owls tend to hunt along the hedges. So they would be their linear paths where they travel along, hunting small mammals like mice. Frogs as well. Frogs migrate in the spring. Around about now, they're laying their spawn, but frogs go to specific shared ponds and places to spawn. And they travel along the same route generation after generation. And a frog is susceptible to drying out quite easily. So they need wet habitats to travel through. Again, we have drained a lot of our fields. We've have a lot of spring droughts in recent years. So a good big deep wet ditch beside a hedge can be an important route for things like frogs to travel along. I could probably spend the next hour describing all the different bugs and frogs and insects and everything that thrives and lives in a hedge. But again, frogs would be food for barn owls and those other more charismatic species that we love that are really, really suffering in the landscape. In Ireland now, kestrels and sparrowhawks as well would often hunt along hedgerows. If you think of a species poor grassy field that's somewhat intensively managed compared to a hedgerow, there's going to be a lot more diversity, a lot more abundance of food in a hedgerow. Also, the berries in autumn are very important for all sorts of birds who come and feed along our hedges. Spring, here we go. There's our primroses. One of my favorite hedgerow flowers, and these primroses are out soon anyway. See this fella here? This is lesser celandine with the shiny heart-shaped leaves. I just did Nature File last Saturday. So every Saturday morning I do a 6-minute piece on RTÉ Lyric FM called Nature File, that anybody can listen to, and you can listen back to old episodes as well. But Saturday, what just gone, was all about lesser celandine here, and how they're adapted to come up in the spring. So a lot of our spring flowers, they haven't had time to photosynthesize and build up the energy to flower, yet they want to put out the flowers before the canopy fills up above them and takes the light, so before they're shaded out. So they have to have special mechanisms in order to grow, to have all that energy before they have the chance to spend months photosynthesizing. So lesser celandine has these kind of tubers on their roots, these big chunky roots, and that provides the energy for the lesser celandine to burst into leaf and flower early in the spring. The same would be the case for a lot of the spring bulbs that we'd be familiar with, like the bluebells. I think there's some bluebells. What else have we got growing here? We've got some, I think it's that stinky false nettle, you know, that nettle that really stinks. Hedge woundwort, it's called. And there are some Viola riviniana, the little blue violets, the little wild violets. They're a lovely thing to find in a hedgerow as well, with their little heart-shaped leaves. So you can see all the spring flowers, and Yanni has beautifully portrayed here that the hawthorn, this is May, obviously, but the leaves aren't quite out yet. There's still plenty of light getting down to the ground layer of the hedgerow for all the wee spring flowers. Connectivity. One of the really important functions of hedgerows in our landscape is that they connect up patches of habitat. So like I said about the frogs, they might connect a pond, a spawning site for the frogs. They also connect up small patches of woodland. In Ireland, we have the lowest woodland cover in Europe, bar Malta. And even more of a problem is when those pieces of woodlands are fragmented. So when the landscape around the woodland is hostile to those woodland type species. So hedges, that's why we call them the green veins or the arteries of the landscape. They provide the connectivity in agricultural landscapes that's really so important. And you can just picture the wealth of wildlife living in and flowing through those green veins, linking up different parts of the landscape. Riverside woodlands is another really important feature for connectivity in the landscape. So the more we can have riparian woodlands alongside our rivers, the more we can connect up fragmented patches of woodland habitat. I don't know if I've said before, surrogate, the idea of a surrogate habitat. Hedgerows are really a surrogate woodland habitat. They're not nearly as good as a woodland in terms of the diversity of flora and fauna, but they are a surrogate habitat, and in that they're really valuable. Bats. Bats are the most amazing creatures, and it's quite funny how a lot of people still think, ooh, bats, I don't like bats, they might get caught in my hair. Bats are really, really fascinating creatures. I went earlier this year and interviewed for a new radio documentary that I'm working on. I interviewed Tina Ochney of Bat Conservation Ireland about bats. We went out for a bat walk with her at dusk and got to ask her every question I possibly could want to ask her. And we had bat detectors and we were listening out for the bats, and it was amazing. She brought us along a hedge that had a line of mostly ash trees and some willow trees as well. But Tina was talking about the importance of hedgerows and hedgerow trees in particular for bats. So again, bats would come out at dusk. They travel from their roosting site to wherever they're going to feed, and they won't travel across open ground. Most of the bats, now some are okay, is the I don't know, Leisler's bats, Natterer's bats, I get confused between all the different species, but bats do need hedges to roost in and to travel along. The honeysuckle there, you see that top picture is a honeysuckle. Honeysuckle is one of the most beautiful climbers that was often found in hedges, and honeysuckle actually puts out its scent more strongly at dusk, because the things that pollinate it are moths, and moths are night flying. And what loves to eat moths? Bats do. So again, you can see this theme here. The honeysuckle putting out its scent more strongly at dusk to attract in the moths, and then the bats come along and they love a patch of honeysuckle because there's going to be loads of moths around it, so they get a good feed of the moths that they're going around sending out they're bouncing their sound waves, their echolocation, and listening back for the bounce, the echo of that sound, so they can hone in and catch the little moths. Now it's not just moths, they also eat thousands and thousands of midge each night. We have 9 or 10 species of bats here, but again, connectivity of our hedgerows is really particularly important for bats. And there's a wee moth there. Is that it? Oak beauty. I'm not the best on the moths. We have 1,400 different species of moths in Ireland, which I always find astonishing. Here's our summer illustration. Can you see this, my full screen? Can you see the pictures of us alongside in the middle of that?
I can see the illustration of the tree and the hedgerow.
Can you see
species.
The full illustration?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Okay. I think so. Well, yeah,
Good.
I don't think we're missing anything. The tree looks complete.
Good. So here we have the tree in summer, and you can see there's a lot more leafy canopy, and there's a lot more luscious growth in around the bottom. We've got little veronica, we've got our ferns unfurling, and we've got the foxgloves. Again, foxgloves, there's a lot of foxgloves around West Wicklow. It grows quite well in that stony, somewhat acidic soil. There's wild strawberries. Can you see the bottom left of the photo here are the wild strawberries? Wild strawberries are one of my favorite things in June. My normal walk from the house down to the river, which takes me about 20 minutes, takes me about 40 minutes when the wild strawberries are out in June, because they're just so delicious. You have to poke around. They're more about quality than quantity. They are so tasty. Tiny little juicy wild strawberries. I hope that everybody here has eaten and is looking forward to eating some wild strawberries come June. There's wild roses, again, is another really wonderful thing to see in a hedgerow. And again, we have lots of different species of dog rose and other clambering wild roses in Ireland. They're very difficult to tell apart because they tend to hybridize. There are lots of different caterpillars, again, would feed on the leaves of the wild roses, and they're in turn food for other wildlife in the hedge. In terms of bees, we have 99 species of wild bee in Ireland. The honeybee is not one of those. It's not native to Ireland. We have 99 species of wild bee, and a third of these are threatened with extinction. And a lot of that is to do with habitat loss. Hedgerows are an important habitat for many of our wild bee species who build their nests in the hedge bank. So they need a sandy north-facing bank, the solitary bees, to spend the winter. They don't build a hive like the honeybees do, like we associate. Also, the nectar resources for bees is really important. If you look at the amount of wildflowers in a hedge, whether it's the hawthorn blossom higher up in the hedge, or the little wild strawberry flowers, or the foxgloves, all of those flowering species are providing nectar, which is very important energy food for bees. I've heard it described as like an energy drink. The pollen is what's the protein rich, and the bees need the pollen to feed their young because that's rich in protein. But in order to keep flying around, busy as a bee on a summer day, they need the hit of the nectar, the high energy drink of the nectar. And if you have a landscape which is void of hedges, or where the hedges are all sprayed or removed, and you've got just grasslands with low diversity and not so many flowering species, you've got a problem for bees. And that's why 1/3 of our native bee species in Ireland are threatened with extinction. I find that such a shocking figure. Here we've got nettles. People think of nettles as, not great. I like nettles. I'm on my third portion of nettle soup now in the last fortnight. There's no tradition that you're supposed to make, you're supposed to have nettle soup at least 3 times during Lent to stock up on all the good nutrients in it and cleanse the blood. But nettles are also very good for things like the little aphids, the caterpillars, in turn the ladybirds and other things that eat all those little invertebrates. So all of these things are good, though nettles also indicate high nitrogen status. So threats to our hedges, there are many. Here we can see this was a recent thing last year where Iarn Rod Éireann cleared a huge length of hedgerow along some of their railway lines in Offaly, saying that they were a danger to the line and branches were blowing down. So hedgerow removal is a massive issue, and we've got some figures. Let's see, between 2011 and 2016, there were 223 kilometers of hedges removed. That's under the approval system, the environmental impact assessment regulations. So the EI regulations, we've got just 223 kilometers of hedges removed. And that's quite a lot. And that's a very small proportion of what were actually removed. So under that system, you have to be removing a large amount of hedgerows from your landholding to go through that system. So there's all the other little stretches of hedges that are removed here, there, and everywhere that aren't calculated in that figure. So hedgerow removal is a big problem in Ireland, and we've lost a lot of our hedgerows through their just being cleared away. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot of threats, which is less recognised, of a derelict or relict hedge. So can you see on the right-hand side, this hedge here is very gappy at the bottom. It's just being flailed every year at the same height, horizontal flailing, which means that okay, I'll rewind here a little bit. A hedgerow tree, take a hawthorn tree. It doesn't want to be a hedgerow. It wants to have a tall bole and a big crown. It wants to grow tall. It wants to flower and fruit, and it lives to be about 80 or so, and then it dies. And we as humans, we want our hedgerows, so we have to cut them and manage them and maybe even lay them. I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. But we intervene in order to manage these trees and shrubs in such a way that they will perform for us as a hedgerow. And that's an important thing to recognize, because if they weren't such a useful feature, we wouldn't have them. If farmers didn't value the hedges for their function, we wouldn't have them. So keeping hedges as functional features on the farm is important in itself. And for that, we need to have better condition of hedgerows. About 1/3 of hedgerows in Ireland are in poor condition, so they're relict or remnant. Relict or remnant here is when you've got, so this one is going towards relict or remnant, when it's gappy, stock, the animals can travel, as in sheep can travel through the hedge. It's only functional by way of the barbed wire fence or the sheep fence that's running alongside it, not the hedgerow shrubs in themselves. We don't have a hedgerow survey for Wicklow. There are hedgerow surveys for more than half of counties across Ireland, and they are something that the local heritage officer in each county would have commissioned, gotten the funding from the council to do, and give to people like me to go and do the hedgerow surveys and report back on the findings. And it can be findings over the heritage and the variety and the things that are special about the hedges in that county, as well as the condition of those hedges. And when we know the condition, when we take stock, then we can develop a management plan to address those issues. So for example, in Roscommon and some of those other counties in the northwest, about a quarter of the hedges were classified as being in favourable condition, and more than a quarter were in very poor status, very much on their way out. So we need to know this. So if any of you have any influence there in Wicklow, it is worth getting a hedgerow survey into the county development plan, requesting from your councillors to have a hedgerow survey and a hedgerow management plan for Wicklow, because it is a county by county thing. So yeah, the importance of management. We might have questions on that at the end. Hedge laying. I don't know if any of you have heard of hedge laying. I've got some diagrams here. It's when you take the hedgerow shrub and you cut it down either with a bill hook or a saw, and you kind of lay it over. So when you get if you can picture the bole of a tree, like a hawthorn tree, you cut it almost all the way through, but you leave this tongue at the edge, and then you bend the whole thing over. And because you've got this bit of the cambium just under the outer layer of the bark, still connected to the base, the nutrients can still travel from the roots to the top of the shrub, which is now laid over. So it's still a living hedge, but it's being kind of woven into itself. There's lots of different styles. I went to the All Ireland Hedge Laying Championship on the Westmeath Offaly border there in October, which was the first. It had been stalled for a few years because of COVID, but it was amazing to see about 20 different hedge layers, each with a stretch of hedge to lay, each doing the most beautiful job of weaving this kind of living linear basket of hedgerow. And it's you can see here at the bottom, see where my mouse is moving around? One of those kind of tongues of the hedge where it's still attached to the base, but it's laid over. And what you get as a result of hedge laying is a very thick growth of all that thorny growth from the hawthorn in particular, coming from the base of the hedge. So you're providing a good thick stock-proof boundary for at least the next 20 years, and you're providing a very dense habitat for nesting birds, and you're preventing the hedge from becoming derelict. So hedge laying is something that's it's a craft that would have been widely practiced. I've gone back to the spot where I grew up in West Wicklow as an adult several times, and I was so delighted to see that the hedgerows there had been laid. You can see evidence of it. So in the past, where you can see those boles that are now old, and laid over, but you can see that they're kind of lying almost horizontal. They wouldn't be horizontal because then the sap can't travel. They have to be kind of at a bit of an angle, maybe a 45-degree angle, in order for the sap to still travel up. But yeah, I was amazed to see that the hedges around where I grew up in West Wicklow were laid in the past. So it is a tradition that definitely would have been present in Wicklow in the past and is not practiced very much at all anymore. Now, next, I don't know what's happening there. There we go, the legal framework. We have a Wildlife Act, section 46 covers hedgerow cutting, and it says that there shall be no cutting from the 1st of March to the 31st of August. There's been a huge amount of, there was an attempt to change to shorten that nesting season, so that you could cut, I think it was from the beginning of April and start again in August. There was 32,000 people in Ireland signed the campaign for No Slash and Burn, and that was a wonderful NGO campaign where An Taisce and the Irish Wildlife Trust and the Irish Beekeepers Association and lots of other NGOs got together to say, we don't, and the slash and burn, because it also related to the burning period in the uplands as well as the cutting of the hedges. There's the new Heritage Act passed in July 2018. The burning in the uplands was extended to March, but the hedgerow bit is now subject to ministerial discretion. So far it has effectively remained as it was, but it's each year down to ministerial discretion. In terms of legal protection as well, there's also a lot to be done by the local authorities. So in terms of the Wicklow County Development Plan, I haven't read it. It would be really important to have stipulations put in the planning aspects. So for new developments, that the hedgerows shall either be retained where possible or replaced where they're removed. It's also important that the engineers in the council have a policy of cutting the hedges in a good way. You can cut a hedge really well in a way that supports the hedge to grow healthy, or you can cut a hedge really, really badly. And you can guess what most local authorities and most contractors do in Ireland is cut the hedge pretty badly. They come along and they cut the whole thing horizontally at the same height, and that promotes that growth up to the top, and it creates a gappy hedge. The ideal, though again, there is no one size fits all, but the ideal is to cut a hedge in a kind of an A shape, so that you're allowing the light to get to the base of the shrubs as well. And you can even leave a bit of like a mohawk on top, so that there is still some flowering and fruiting even when you're flailing the side of the hedge. It's also important that all the hedges, let's say on a landholding, are not cut at the same time. So a landowner might do well to cut 1/5 of the hedges each year and rotate that, because it takes about 4 years for the hedges to flower and fruit again after they've been flailed. So all of these things require sensitive management by practitioners who are well informed about hedges and the merits of hedges and what's good management and what's bad management. I've never seen a high-macked hedge in Wicklow, but up in the northwest, there's a lot of high-macking that goes on. That's basically coming in with a high-mack, pushing all the boles over. The hedge reacts by sending out a whole lot of new growth the next year because it's nearly dead and it's struggling for its last bit of life. And then because you've high-macked over, you've damaged the trunk, you've exposed the roots, it'll be exposed to all sorts of virus and fungus and will die off in time, but that weakens the hedge. Similarly, flailing with a flail where the blades are not sharp enough, you know, when you see the kind of shattered edges, that leaves rot to get in, and over time that will weaken the hedge. So it's really important that that the blades on the flail are sharp and the flailing is carried out before the sap is up in the trees, which also happens to be before the nesting season. So there's a double advantage there. You don't want to cut back a shrub when the sap is up, because it damages the health and the vigor of each individual hawthorn. We have a hedgerow appraisal system. Oh, look, there we go, autumn. This is another one of Yanni Peters' gorgeous pictures, and you can see so much going on in the hedge in the autumn. You've got all the berries. So we've got like field fares and waxwings. They're two types of birds that travel here each autumn, all the way from Scandinavia, because they love feasting on all of our hedgerow berries. So all of our haws and the rose hips and the sloes and all the other berries that are so amazing in the hedges each autumn. I made haw syrup, rose hip syrup, sorry, for the first time last year, which was delicious, has a real nice tang to it, and it's really rich in vitamin C. But these are important food for a lot of our mammals as well as our birds. Spindle and rowan have a lot of berries as well. There's an interesting quirk with the black or the dark berries versus the red berries. Red berries stand out better against a green backdrop. So if you think of holly and spiky holly leaves and the red berries in the winter, they tend to be there before the leaves have fallen off the trees, so they're more visible to the birds and the mammals that are looking for them. whereas the blackberries stand out better against no foliage. So for the blackthorn, the leaves will tend to be gone or going in the September and October when the sloes are out, and the sloes are really black, they're dark. So it's an interesting thing in the strategy of each tree, which color to make its berries so that they'll stand out better to be eaten up and pooed out a mile down the road to reproduce their kind. So let's see, I think that's it. I've flown through that now. Mammals, have I lost a slide? Wood mice, shrews, foxes, pine martens, badgers, stoats, hedgehogs, all of these things live in our hedges. Yeah, I think that's most of what I wanted to cover. So